Okay, it's 12:30 now, so let's start. Welcome to the ANU Indonesia Project Global Seminar. My name is Arianto Patundru. I'm hosting this today's program with Catherine Whitney and Alex Gotts. We acknowledge the first Australians and pay our respect to elders past, present, and emerging. We are grateful for the support from the Australian National University and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Today's webinar is part of our series on economic development in Indonesia, and we will be talking about Indonesia's industrial policies with a focus on the case of nickel sector and seeing it in the context of economic nationalism and global value chain. So this includes the much debated topic recently, that is the hilirisasi or downstreaming policy as a key part of President Jokowi's economic strategy. Our speaker today is Dr. Kyung-Hoon Kim, an Associate Research Fellow at the Korean Institute for International Economic Policy, KIEP, in Korea. He holds a PhD in Development Studies and Political Economy from King's College London. He also has a master's from the London School of Economics. Kim is joining us from Japan today. So thank you, Kyung-Hoon. And as usual, we will have a Q&A session after the talks. But if you want, you can write your question anytime on the Q&A box, not on the chat box, and we will attend to them after the presentation. I will also allow some direct questions from the audience who raised their virtual hands later. And please also kindly respond to the little polling on your screen if it appears, because we need it to improve our series. So thank you so much. And without further ado, let me invite Dr. Kyung-Hoon Kim to share his presentation. Over to you, Kim.
Hello, thanks for the introduction. My name is Kyung-Hoon Kim, and as Arianto has kindly mentioned, I'm currently working as an Associate Research Fellow at the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, or KIEP. KIEP is a Korean government think tank that researches international trade, investment, and development policies and conducts in-depth regional studies. I'm currently analyzing the industrial policies of Asia's large developing countries with a focus on India and Indonesia. And I appreciate ANU inviting me to give a talk today because over the years I've learned so much from ANU's economists and political scientists studying Indonesia. In today's presentation, I'll discuss Indonesia's recent nickel sector industrial policies, concentrating on explaining the content and effect of these policies and placing them within broader historical, economic, and political contexts. Today's presentation is based on a chapter of my book that I'm currently writing and a research project that I'll be conducting at KIEP, and I'll be grateful for any comments or feedback. So today's presentation is organized as follows. I'll firstly discuss the background of the emergence of the nickel sector industrial policies and more broadly, the so-called resource protectionism in Indonesia. I'll then look at key aspects of Indonesia's nickel sector industrial policies, which do not only involve regulations in the mining and metal sectors, but also include government efforts to promote the electric vehicle industry in Indonesia. I'll then offer early indicators that offer a glimpse into the effects of Indonesia's nickel sector industrial policies. While a longer period is required to properly assess the overall effects, I'll argue that early signs suggest that the policies have so far been successful. I'll then close by trying to answer some questions that I've recently received during interviews with some newspapers. The questions cover various issues, such as the World Trade Organization's recent verdict and the United States Inflation Reduction Act, as well as the effect of adopting similar industrial policies in other mineral segments. I would like to start by firstly answering the following question. As we've been hearing over the past decade, are we really seeing a surge in protectionism in the Indonesian economy? The answer is yes and no. If the question is referring to the Indonesian economy on the whole, I would not be persuaded if someone answered yes to that question. For instance, Indonesia's simple mean tariff rate has remained relatively flat over the past decade. The story is similar when looking at foreign direct investment or FDI regulatory restrictiveness index. We've also seen the ease of doing business index, though the index has been temporarily discontinued due to measurement issues, has shown a dramatic change, suggesting further liberalization under Jokowi. Overall, one may argue that liberalization may have stalled, but that does not necessarily mean that protectionism has strengthened under Jokowi if looking at the Indonesian economy as a whole. However, if looking at these indicators by sectors, there's significant variation. While there have been slight ups and downs, the recent tariff rate for manufactured goods and the FDI regulatory restrictiveness index for the secondary and tertiary sectors have remained stable or indicate further liberalization compared to the 2000s. However, strong protectionism is visible in the primary sector. In particular, if looking at the FDI regulatory restrictiveness index by subsector in the graph on the right, we see that the index for mining has increased the most by 0.22 between 2010 and 2020. Therefore, what we are seeing in Indonesia is resource protectionism, which is what I plan to take a deep dive in for today's presentation. While I will go through the details of nickel sector industrial policies later, just understand for the time being that these resource protectionist policies aim to increase the benefits that the domestic economy gains from selling natural resources and often involve measures to go downstream and develop manufacturing capacity. To understand Indonesia's resource protectionism, the obvious point from which to start is the country's colonial history. There are obvious, uncanny similarities between now and then, namely the flow of natural resources from Sulawesi and Moluccas to richer countries, with a large part of rent residing with the latter. Not only that, today's Indonesian leaders in charge and support of nickel sector industrial policies have often emphasized that these measures are required to escape the extractive trap that characterized the colonial era. As we are all aware, the Dutch colonization of Indonesia lasted over 3 centuries and was centered on exploiting Indonesia's vast natural resources. In the early 17th century, small areas of East Indies were under the influence of the Dutch United East Asia Company, also known as VOC, which was attracted to the spices found in the archipelago. State-sponsored VOC's spice monopoly flourished commercially during the 17th century, and this company state's military presence and political control were dominant in the archipelago by the end of century. Between 1795 and 1820, the archipelago's dominant controller shifted from the Dutch to France and Britain and back to the Dutch with the currents of European conflicts involving the Napoleonic Wars. The following century was characterized by colonial expansionism as the Dutch extended control to the territory of modern-day Indonesia by 1920. Among the numerous motivations behind the Dutch colonial expansion that have been presented, the strongest driver was unarguably financial profits. East Indies' production of cash crops, metals, and petroleum were an important revenue source for the Dutch, as much of their value could be extracted by the colonizer through forced labor, resource exploitation, and taxation. By independence in 1945, Indonesia had been stuck for more than 3 centuries at the bottom of what is now known as the global value chain, run by one of the world's first multinational companies, namely VOC, the Dutch government, and other imperial powers. As can be seen in these graphs on value-added, employment, and trade, Indonesia was heavily dependent on the natural resource sector during colonization and struggled to get out of this structure for several decades after independence. Considering Indonesia's long, bloody, and arduous colonization period, it is unsurprising then to find anti-imperial sentiments and decolonization movements acting as core drivers of Indonesia's economic policymaking during the decades following independence. While the pendulum has swung between economic liberalism and statism over the past 70 years, the pendulum has never swung too far towards economic liberalism, as the gravity of economic nationalism that has been embedded in Indonesia, as strongly as the colonial exploitation had been, continued to hold the pendulum steady. Next, I would like to discuss Indonesia's economic background in the 2010s, when we began to see the emergence of resource protectionism. Indonesia's economic performance during the first 2 decades of the 21st century was impressive, as the graph on the left shows. Indonesia's average GDP growth rate was higher than the average for developing countries, and the growth trajectory has shown significant stability as reflected in a very low standard deviation. At the same time, however, Indonesia has failed to display the explosive growth that some East Asian countries, including China, have shown. In the late 2000s, China's PPP GDP per capita overtook Indonesia's, and the gap has been widening since then, as the graph on the right shows. In this context, policymakers and the general public have begun to ask themselves what Indonesia is not doing that other East Asian countries have done to accelerate economic development. Perhaps the most visible difference is the role that manufacturing has played in Indonesia and East Asian countries. While East Asian countries have experienced sustained structural transformation spearheaded by the manufacturing sector, Indonesia has not. Indonesia's manufacturing sector began to grow rapidly from the 1970s, but this manufacturing-led structural transformation came to an end in the 1990s when Indonesia was hit by the Asian financial crisis. Manufacturing value-added share declined in the first half of the 2000s and stagnated, while the service sector, centered around low productivity service subsectors, expanded rapidly. Sectoral employment share have seen a similar pattern. These patterns of economic structural transformation and mediocre economic growth acted as a wake-up call to policymakers in the early to mid-2010s and encouraged them to start tinkering with industrial policy. Next, I will discuss political background. There have been efforts to view the recent economic nationalism through a political lens. A main line of explanation points to the electoral strategy of political parties in young democratic Indonesia. The graph on the left is from Dr. Fossati's paper that shows that since there's limited cleavage in the ideological stance of Indonesia's major political parties on economic issues, nationalism is often used to signal parties' dedication to improving the economic situation for the general population. In other words, in Indonesia, where there is no clear left-right economic division in the political arena, nationalism is, according to Dr. Aspinall, a useful legitimating device by which the major parties and presidential candidates can try to distinguish themselves from rivals and court public support. During the 2014 presidential election, the two candidates put out equally nationalistic rhetoric on economic challenges and solutions, and they both emphasized their attachment to Sukarnoist nationalism. For the political elite, the promotion of an economic nationalism is a sound strategy considering the anti-foreign sentiment that has been entrenched across Indonesian society over decades since independence. Just after the beginning of Jokowi's first administration, results of an international survey confirmed Indonesian society's strong support for economic nationalism, as you can see in the graphs in the center. The percentage of respondents who said that their country should be able to meet all of its own needs without needing to rely on imports from other countries was highest in Indonesia at 78%, 38 percentage points higher than the average across 19 countries. 42% of Indonesian respondents felt that it is unacceptable for foreign investors to buy companies in their countries. This figure was third highest and 29 percentage points higher than the average. In a separate survey conducted around the beginning of Jokowi's second administration, 88% of Indonesian respondents said that the government should protect its economy more strongly against foreign competitors, the highest level across 14 countries. Against this background, one may quickly reach the conclusion that these industrial policies are simply outcomes of historical bitterness, economic dissatisfaction, and political populism, rather than rational decisions. However, I think that policymakers do have a rationality in mobilizing industrial policies in the natural resource sector, and I will attempt to explain what is going on in policymakers' heads. So focusing on the mining sector, which is often at the center of the so-called resource protectionism, there are two main areas of policy decisions, namely how much to produce or export and who benefits from mining. The reasons for controlling the level of production or exports are relatively straightforward. Suppliers may control output in an attempt to determine the price. Nationalists argue that the country's resources should be sold at appropriate prices, and to do that, the producers must have a say in determining these prices. However, this strategy is not easy to implement as its success depends on various factors such as future demand and price elasticity, and is potentially viable only if the producer is a dominant market player and its outputs are not easily substitutable. Nationalist export controls may also be linked to societal reasons such as securing resources for domestic demand. And more generally, governments may also control overall production based on concerns related to environmental degradation, land exploitation, and deterioration of working conditions. Another related rationale is that international consumers of mining products do not appropriately compensate for these negative externalities. The issue of who should be in charge of and benefit from mining is more complex. The views of many foreign actors, including multinational corporations and nationalistic domestic actors, are different. This figure on the left summarizes foreign investors' views. External investors' logic is that because they have superior industrial knowledge, technology, and financing capacity, they can exploit resources more efficiently than local actors. If the domestic government designs adequate contracts to collect taxes and loyalty, its economy can enjoy a sufficient proportion of benefits. These benefits will be larger in when resources were developed by domestic players with inferior capabilities, particularly when there's a weak domestic competition and transparency. This view suggests that the most appropriate policy option for commodity-rich developing countries is to not only focus on mining in which they have a comparative advantage, but also allow international companies to do that mining. This logic leads to a conclusion that government intervention favoring domestic producers will lead to a lose-lose situation. Nationalistic domestic actors have a different view, as shown in the figure on the right. They acknowledge the superior production and financing ability of international companies. However, foreign investors often hold a strong position during negotiations with the government because of their business power. Therefore, the government will struggle to demand a proportion of benefits large enough to justify foreign companies' participation. So, contempt towards foreign companies tends to be strong when international commodity prices are high and foregone domestic benefits seem large. Based on this assessment, economic nationalists argue that the government needs to provide preferences to local entities. Even if operations are less efficient under this strategy, it is argued that larger domestic proportion of smaller total profits may be more beneficial for the country. And there are further rationales, particularly for situations in which the domestic benefits in the immediate future are expected to be weaker than an alternative scenario in which foreign companies lead operations. Geological products are not plump strawberries that need to be picked soon so that they do not go to waste. Also, they are finite and their proven reserves tend to be stable. If these products are not dug up quickly because of limited efficiency, then they can wait underground and profits can be reaped in the future. The main interest from a nationalist perspective is more about who benefits from these resources. Moreover, mining from upstream to downstream requires specific skills and technology. A strong emphasis is often put on links to downstream segments as they can contribute to industrialization. Nationalists have argued that acquiring capacities and benefiting from learning by doing, spillovers, and positive externalities require significant investment with a long-term horizon. This view suggests that weak domestic benefits in the short term are the price that the country should accept during the transition. So this is the background of the emergence of resource protectionism in Indonesia. Next, I'll take a closer look at the policies that the Indonesian government has implemented in the nickel sector. So when Indonesia was considering adopting nickel sector industrial policies, the market condition was favorable. The demand for nickel, which has mainly been used in producing stainless steel, has been steadily increasing, as the graph on the left shows. This trend has been mainly driven by China's consumption. Then came the electric vehicle revolution, which is causing a large surge in nickel demand. This phenomenon has been driven by various global trends, such as massive economic stimulus policies following the 2008 global financial crisis and COVID-19 pandemic, mainstreaming of green politics in several Western countries, and green technology competition, which have all led to electric vehicle friendly subsidies, infrastructure development, and regulatory changes. So sales of new plug-in electric cars was less than 8,000 back in 2010. In 2020, 3 million units were sold, and the International Energy Agency forecasts that this number will increase to 28 million by 2030. The recent focus on the high nickel cathode chemistries in the battery sector suggests a rapid expansion of nickel demand in the future. In 2019, 69% of the world's nickel demand arose in the stainless steel industry, while the battery sector accounted for only 6% of nickel consumption. Over the next 2 decades, the stainless steel industry will continue to be a dominant consumer of nickel, but the battery sector will emerge as a new major consumer. One study, as shown in the figure in the center, expects the battery industry's nickel consumption to grow 13.5% per annum between 2020 and 2040, which is more than 3 times the growth rate of total nickel demand. As a result, the battery industry could account for 26% of total nickel consumption by 2030 and 36% by 2040. This rapid increase would be mainly driven by the demand in the electric vehicle sector, which would account for 95% of the battery sector's nickel consumption by 2040. Indonesia is to benefit from this nickel boom as it produces almost half of the nickel ores, as the graph on the right shows, though Indonesia wanted a bigger slice of the growing pie, which is where industrial policies came in. In 2009, the Indonesian government adopted a new law on mineral and coal mining, or what I refer to as the mining law in this presentation. This law was perhaps the most significant piece of legislation since the 1967 mining law adopted under Suharto. The new mining law gives the central government the authority to set the amount of production and export of mining products with an aim of ensuring that there is sufficient domestic supply. The domestic market obligation, or the DMO percentages, are set by the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources on an annual basis based on a forecast of domestic use and production. Another nationalistic policy prohibits exports of metal ores and requires mining companies to conduct processing and refining in Indonesia and add value to minerals domestically. The deadlines for implementing domestic minerals processing and refining regulations were announced in 2012. Production mining business license holders at the production phase had until January 2014, exploration license holders until February 2015, and production license holders at the construction phase until February 2016. These details accompanied a regulation that prohibited the exportation of ore and raw minerals from May 2012. As can be seen in this table, various transitional measures, such as loosening conditionalities for certain minerals, were adopted to limit the shock in the industry and incentivize the construction of processing and refining facilities. Under all of these legislations, mining companies needed to obtain export permits that the government gave out based on the examinations of various factors, such as the company's progress in constructing domestic processing and refining capacity. There conflicts your views as to whether this process was a policy flip-flop or fine-tuning. Whatever it was, it came to an end in the nickel sector at least, when the complete ban on nickel ore was imposed in 2020. Another key resource protectionist policy was shared divestment obligation. Again, there was policy flip-flop or fine-tuning for several years, as can be seen in the table on the left. In 2017, the government settled on limiting the foreign ownership in a mining entity operating in Indonesia to 80% by the 6th year of production, declining annually to reach 49% by the 10th year. And this rule was applied to partially nationalize some of the largest foreign miners in Indonesia. A key target was Freeport Indonesia, a major copper and gold miner whose parent was US-based Freeport McMoran. There's also a link here to the colonial era, since Freeport Indonesia's Grasberg mine is situated in West New Guinea, which the Netherlands refused to hand over to Indonesia for years after independence. This area was the source of a major nationalist wave across the archipelago in the late 1950s, after Indonesia repeatedly failed to make the United Nations assist negotiations with the Netherlands regarding the transfer of this land. The result was a mass riot that also led to a takeover and nationalization of over 700 Dutch firms. West New Guinea was eventually transferred to Indonesia, and the region was fully integrated into Indonesia in 1969. And there was another interesting turn in history when Suharto opened up West New Guinea, which represented the anti-imperialists' latest victory, to American mining company Freeport. After operating in Indonesia for over 50 years, Freeport Indonesia was partially nationalized in 2018. The government bought shares worth almost $4 billion, increasing its ownership from 9% to 51%, while the original parent, Freeport McMoran's shareholding, reduced from 91% to 49%. While Freeport is not a major nickel producer, I've highlighted this event considering Freeport Indonesia's stature in Indonesia's mining. Returning to the nickel sector, the Indonesian government has also attained 20% of Vale Indonesia, one of the largest nickel producers in the country, by paying approximately $290 million. As a result of this transaction, ownership shares of Vale Canada Limited and Sumitomo Metal Mining in Vale Indonesia have been reduced to 44% and 15% respectively. Another key resource protectionist policy involved establishing a state holding company in the mining sector in 2017. The central government shifted its shares in mining companies, namely nickel producer Antam, coal producer Bukit Asam, and tin producer Timah, to aluminium producer Inalum. Inalum was chosen as the holding company because it was the main wholly owned state enterprise in the mining sector, whereas other state miners have been partially privatized in the past, with the government remaining as a major shareholder. The holding company has been rebranded to Mind ID. The Indonesian government expects this holding company to act as a national champion in the mining sector. Mind ID has grown rapidly in recent years, as the graph on the left shows, and has now become one of the largest state enterprises in Indonesia, as the table in the center shows. With a greater capacity to leverage using enlarged assets, the company has been able to act as the government agent for carrying out the nationalization mentioned in the previous slide. Mind ID has been the chief negotiator during the share transfer process with Freeport Indonesia and Vale Indonesia, as well as being the purchaser of the shares. Since Mind ID and its subsidiaries are also subject to export ban and requirements to build smelters and processors, they also play an important role in investing in resource-based industrialization. Furthermore, the Indonesian government has adopted various policies to establish the electric vehicle ecosystem. The Indonesian government is attempting to build an electric vehicle production value chain across the country by leveraging its position as a main miner of nickel ore and producer of nickel metal. The government established a state-owned holding company in the battery sector called Indonesia Battery Corporation, which is equally owned by miners Antam and Inalum, electricity generator PLN, and oil and gas company Pertamina. Indonesia Battery Corporation is responsible for fostering Indonesia's electric vehicle ecosystem, with each participant being in charge of supporting different stages of value chain, from electricity charging stations to electricity provision. The government has also announced various fiscal incentives, including import duty exemptions and multi-year tax holiday schemes, to attract investment in the electric vehicle sector. Moreover, the size and growth of the domestic market is a key factor for manufacturers in deciding whether to invest in the country. Therefore, the Indonesian government has begun to provide direct subsidies of 7 million rupiah for each new or converted electric motorbike. I'll now discuss some of the effects or outcomes of the nickel sector industrial policies. To measure the overall and net effect of industrial policies, detailed data such as value added, opportunity costs, and so on are required. However, for the time being, we do not have such data and must make judgments based on leading indicators. I'll discuss indicators that suggest early signs of success. Firstly, let's take a look at the nickel ore production in the graph on the left. After a sharp fall in production due to the sudden export ban in 2014, production recovered between 2017 and 2020 as the export ban was conditionally loosened. The production level in 2020, the year of the complete export ban, declined slightly but remained robust, and the production level in 2021 exceeded the highest level before the export ban. Another important trend is that now all nickel ore is supplied for domestic processing, while most was exported before the export ban. You can also find the consequence of this trend in the graph on the right. This graph shows a sudden drop in exports of nickel ores and a significant increase in nickel-related products, such as ferronickel and stainless steel. These trends are the result of huge FDI, especially that from China. As can be seen in the graph on the left, FDI in the metal sector bypassed that of the mining sector since 2019, led by companies such as Tsingshan. Much of this investment has aimed at building nickel smelters and processors, especially in and around industrial zones, such as the Weda Bay Industrial Park or Morowali Industrial Park. As of 2021, there were 25 nickel processors in the country, and this number is expected to more than double if those being constructed and planned are complete in the future. Having established its position as a major producer of primary refined nickel, Indonesia aims to go further up the value chain. Currently, smelters are aimed at producing low nickel containing class 2 products through pyrometallurgy, but several new plants will aim at producing battery quality class 1 products through hydrometallurgy. Production of battery cathode usually requires class 1 products containing more than 99.8% nickel from processing sulfide resources, which Indonesia does not have. With a significant increase in demand for battery cathode, companies in Indonesia have begun exploring new technologies to turn laterite resources into intermediate products, which can then be refined to class 1 products. One way is to process Indonesia's nickel through hydrometallurgical treatment using high-pressure acid leaching, also known as HPAL. Mixed hydroxide precipitates, or MHP, or mixed sulfide precipitates, or MSP, are produced through this complex process and can then be purified to produce nickel sulfate class 1 products that can be used in batteries. The Indonesian government aims to establish itself as a major producer of MHP and MSP during 2020 and 2024 and become a significant producer of nickel sulfate during 2025 and 2035. Another outcome, although still in its initial stages, is the extension and expansion of the electric vehicle value chain in Indonesia. On top of investment in nickel mining and smelting, many companies have announced plans to invest in the battery and electric vehicle production across the country. I would like to highlight that Korean conglomerates have been the main driver behind investment spree in the electric vehicle value chain. As you can see in this table, Korean businesses have established themselves in the downstream sections of the value chain for electric vehicle production in Southeast Asia, and their presence is noteworthy, particularly in Indonesia. Korean companies are late in establishing automobile manufacturing bases in Indonesia compared to Japanese competitors. However, with electric vehicle manufacturing, Korean companies have been moving ahead. The Korean companies, searching to gain access to Indonesia's huge nickel resources and market, have taken the Indonesian government's industrialization and value-adding goals seriously and responded quickly. A number of Korean entities are planning to invest billions of dollars in establishing battery and car production lines, a nickel smelter, and a precursor and cathode factory. Some of the most notable projects have been Hyundai's first car factory in Southeast Asia that began operating in 2022, as well as a massive battery factory being built by the LG consortium. In order to gain a stable supply of resources and access to the market, Korean companies have decided to collaborate with Indonesia's state enterprises in this strategic sector, signing a memorandum of understanding with the previously mentioned Indonesia Battery Corporation. So by attracting investment in the electric vehicle value chain, the Indonesian government aims to increase local contents from 40% to 80% by 2026 in the case of 2- and 3-wheeled electric vehicles, and from 35% to 80% by 2030 in the case of 4 or more wheeled electric vehicles, ultimately contributing to Indonesia's industrialization. The early success in nickel sector industrial policies is providing the government with legitimacy and political support for adopting similar measures in other mineral segments. The government has plans to adopt an export ban and requirements to process raw ores in areas such as bauxite, copper, and tin. These measures are a key feature of Indonesia's long-term master plan for achieving resource-based industrialization that you can see in the figure on the left. And I will return to this issue later. Moreover, the recent achievement in the nickel sector is likely to give the government more room to adopt protectionist policies in other natural resource sectors. President Jokowi has recently mentioned fisheries, agriculture, and plantation sectors as potential areas that may benefit from downstreaming. In sum, we are likely to see a continued or even strengthened resource protectionism in the near future following the success of nickel sector industrial policies. Next, I will present my answers to some questions on Indonesia's nickel sector that I've recently received. The first question is whether the World Trade Organization, or WTO, will be able to stop Indonesia from implementing nickel sector policies. My answer is pretty straightforward, and it is no. Several countries have criticized Indonesia's policies and challenged the legality of these measures. The European Union, or EU, asked the WTO to establish a panel to examine the export restrictions on nickel ore. The EU argued that the export ban and domestic processing requirements illegally restrict access to EU steel producers to raw materials needed for stainless steel production. In November of last year, the panel found that Indonesia's policies violated WTO rules and recommended that Indonesia bring its measures into conformity. In December, Indonesia notified the Dispute Settlement Board of its decision to appeal to the appellate body certain issues of law and legal interpretations in the panel reports. The Indonesian government has used this conflict to rouse domestic popular support. President Jokowi's response has been blunt and on some occasions fiery. Referring to the EU's complaint at the WTO, President Jokowi stated that we will fight in any way and that it doesn't matter if they keep on suing us. This is our nickel from our country. And I'll give you a minute to read Jokowi's more recent remark at the commemoration of 50th anniversary of PDIP that you can find in the box on the right. I think that this speech is an important piece of evidence displaying how the legacy of colonial experience lives on in Indonesia's politics and economic policymaking. Of course, the strongest weapon of all for Jokowi is the Article 33 of the Constitution that states that the land and waters and the natural wealth contained in it shall be controlled by the state and utilized for the optimal welfare of the people. President Jokowi's stance may appear stubborn, but in fact, it increasingly looks like a calculated and strategic one. Solving cases at the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism is usually cumbersome and tedious and takes a long time. Therefore, even if Indonesia is proven to have violated international trade rules, the final conclusion would be reached after significant investment have already entered Indonesia. And considering the pace of recent capital inflows and future development plans in the nickel sector, restrictive policies may not even be necessary by the time the final conclusion is reached. Furthermore, considering that many multinational companies, not just domestic ones, are now involved in or linked to Indonesia's nickel value chain, home countries of these companies may hesitate to put forward retaliatory measures. All of this is happening while the influence of and trust in the WTO is weakening. We've been reading a number of articles with titles such as "The WTO is dead." Therefore, don't expect Indonesia to back down anytime soon. Another issue is the United States Inflation Reduction Act passed in August 2022. The Inflation Reduction Act's electric vehicle provisions state that for electric vehicle buyers to receive $3,750 in tax credits, a certain percentage of the value of the applicable critical minerals, including nickel, contained in batteries needs to be either extracted, processed in the US or its free trade agreement partners, or recycled in North America. Buyers can receive another $3,750 in tax credits if a certain percentage of the value of the components in the electric vehicle batteries is manufactured or assembled in North America. These applicable percentages, which are going to increase over the rest of the decade, as seen in the graph on the left, are exacerbating uncertainty for the Indonesian government, as well as the companies that are planning to invest in downstream industries in Indonesia. The Inflation Reduction Act, or the potentially worrying provision, is surrounding foreign entities of concern, with the details provided in the box on the right. If the critical minerals in the battery are extracted, processed, or recycled, or if any components in the battery are manufactured or assembled by a foreign entity of concern, the buyers of the vehicle that carries this battery are not eligible for tax credits. This rule has implications not only for the Chinese metal companies in Indonesia, but also for Korean companies that have established partnerships with them. Since Indonesia's nickel sector has key implications for the global value chain and global economy, the current situation may exacerbate U.S. China tensions surrounding Indonesia. With Indonesia-originated nickel likely to play a role in fulfilling the increasing U.S. demand in the future, as seen in the graph on the left, Indonesia may see concessions. The U.S. Treasury is expected to announce the electric vehicle battery sourcing guidance soon. One possible method under discussion is treating members of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPF, as free trade agreement partners. Without these concessions, Indonesia, which is already cautiously approaching the US-led IPF, may lean instead towards its key nickel sector investor, China, as seen in the graph on the right, in order to save what Jokowi is calling one of his greatest achievements. This outcome would force Korean companies, which are already making significant investments in US electric vehicle and battery manufacturing, to rethink their global value chain strategy. And I will close the presentation by discussing the potential implementation of similar industrial policies in other mineral segments. While optimistic about nickel sector industrial policies, I'm more skeptical about policies in other mineral segments. The main reason is obvious. Indonesia does not have as much market power in other areas as it does in nickel. Demand may be there, particularly in the case of copper and cobalt for battery making, and Indonesia may benefit from linkage effect considering its growing nickel sector, but there's a doubt regarding how much leverage it would have considering its relatively small shares in global production. Moreover, linkage effect would depend significantly on Indonesia's infrastructure connecting various islands, considering minerals are found in diverse parts of the archipelago. President Jokowi has recognized this problem, and much of the outcome will depend on how quickly connectivity and transportation improves. So anyway, in the nickel sector, there's no going back, and Indonesia's position is going to keep strengthening over the next decade. Therefore, we'll have to continue monitoring the economic, political, and diplomatic consequences of Indonesia's nickel sector industrial policies. While I have not dealt with issues related to environment and laborers' working conditions, these are also important future research areas. I'll end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kyung-hoon, a very illuminating presentation. And we now move to question and answer session. You can type your question in the chat box, in the Q&A box, but also you can raise your hand. I see some questions already, but let me check if those writing these questions can actually directly ask their question. First is Ross. Let me check with Ross. Okay, Ross McLeod from ANU just raised his hand. So let me, okay. Yep, now you can talk, Ross. Yes, go ahead, please.
You can hear me, Ato?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's a very interesting topic, and I've been interested in this for a long time. You mentioned towards the end of the presentation, Article 33 of the Constitution. And that article, amongst other things, requires the government to control the use of natural resources like nickel for the maximum benefit of the people. I contend that in order to maximize the benefit to the Indonesian people, it is necessary to allow nickel ore to be processed in the most efficient manner possible, wherever that may be the case. I take it as self-evident that the rest of the world, somewhere in the rest of the world, can do this smelting process more cheaply, more efficiently than Indonesia can. Otherwise, the market would automatically determine the smelting would take place in Indonesia itself. So if we force the smelting to occur in Indonesia, we necessarily reduce the benefit to the people, because the benefit to the people is basically the value of the finished nickel on the international market less the processing cost. All of this emphasis on increasing value added is just incorrect from an economist's point of view. You can certainly increase value added in this particular sector, but what we care about is increasing value added in the economy as a whole. And that's where we're missing out here. So I guess I'd like you to respond to that. I guess my basic concern is that I didn't hear enough about the economics of this this policy during your presentation. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ross. Over to you, Kyung-hoon.
Thank you very much for your comment. I completely agree about the level of efficiency being higher by processing in other countries, perhaps in China. And that will, from an economic point of view, will bring the greatest benefit to the people. However, the president is using this policy as a political tool, and his argument, I believe, and the government's view is that by bringing in investment, it will be able to generate much value added within the country, and also generate jobs, which I do not agree because it's very capital intensive. And also by attracting investment in the midstream section of the value chain, it will be able to attract investment in the very downstream of the electric vehicle value chain. And we are actually seeing some strong outcome of this, as I've shown that investment in the electric vehicle sector and the battery sector is increasing rapidly, as well as the investment in the mineral processing and refining. And I think, although it may be less efficient currently to process ores, process ores in Indonesia, I think it is very difficult to argue against the outcome of the FDI. I think the government is continue using this evidence to push forward its policies.
Okay, thank you, Kyung-hoon. Let's move to the next question by Theo, Sulistyo Ardiono from ANU. Theo, are you there? Okay, maybe we should move to the next question first, and then I will read Theo's question. Let's move now to Rini Astuti, also from ANU. Rini?
Thank you, Pak Acho, and thanks for the insightful presentation, Kyung-hoon. I was late to the presentation. I clicked on the link provided on the email, but didn't work. So my question is actually about the sustainability issues in this nickel and EV sector. So my question first is about, do you have any insights on whether we can actually account the percentage of the nickel that will be produced that will be used in the low carbon technologies, which, for example, EV batteries, as you mentioned, in comparison to the other sector that are, business as usual, such as stainless steel. If you can provide insight on that, that will be really useful. And this is also related with, with whether all of these tax holiday policies provided for businesses in Indonesia is actually using decarbonization as a legitimation, for example, because we don't know for sure how many of this nickel will be used for EVs and other low carbon technologies. That's my first question. The second question will be, what do you think after 2024, whether all of these pet project will be still there, or whether the new regime will continue this dream of downstreaming nickel sector and other mineral sector in Indonesia. Thank you.
Thank you, Renee. Kyung-hun?
Sure. So currently, almost or nearly all of the nickel metal produced, nickel ore produced and nickel metal produced in Indonesia is used for stainless steel production and also for other related areas, because Indonesia is currently producing class 2 metal, which is fairly low in purity. But as I've mentioned in the presentation, several plants have been set up to produce class 1 products with high purity, which can be used in producing battery cathode. And so we'll have to wait a year or two to see the percentage of nickel being used in battery production increase. At the moment, mostly are used in the stainless steel production within Indonesia and also mostly in China. And your second question was on, sorry, what was your second question?
After 2024,
Okay.
after the election, what do you think
Sure,
will
sure,
happen?
sure. Yeah, so considering the huge progress made in nickel sector processing and refining, building refining factories, I think there's no going back. So next 10 years, we will continue to see an increase in nickel production concentration in Indonesia. And Indonesia's position in the nickel sector is only going to increase, considering the investment that is already taking place and the investment projects that have been announced. And also, as I've mentioned, economic nationalism is continue to be a very important tool for major contenders during the presidential election. And I cannot imagine any candidates saying we're going to stop and start allowing companies to export nickel ore in any time soon.
Okay, thank you. Now let me read the questions from Tio, Sulistio Ardiono. So he has two questions. First, the success of nickel industries does not guarantee the same success in other industries, and it can actually potentially backfire on the domestic economy through declining investments and productivity. What is the critical rule of thumb, if any, that such a policy is feasible to pursue? That's question number one. Number two, when talking about the benefit to the domestic economy, what is your indicator of benefit? Kyung-hun?
Thanks very much. So regarding the first question, you're right. We've seen a decline in investment in the mining sector, and that has probably led to a decline in productivity. But at the same time, the aim of the Indonesian government is to develop a more high value adding sectors, namely nickel processing and also battery cathode production, as well as EV vehicle production. So we'll have to balance how much efficiency is lost, productivity is lost by banning export ore, and therefore cause a decline in FDI in the mining sector, and also the increase in investment in the other downstream industries. So we'll have to compare those two plus and minus effects. And when I talk about benefits to the domestic economy, we'll have to look at various issues such as value-added exports, imports, investment, and employment generation, of course. And of course, we cannot forget the environmental effects of all these policies.
Thank you. Now let me invite Joshua Walker to ask his question directly. Joshua? No? Okay, so let me read his question. Joshua Walker asks, is the increasing market share of nickel-free lithium iron phosphate batteries a threat to the long-term competitive viability of Indonesia's EV industry?
Yes, that's perhaps the most important factor in determining the demand for nickel metal in the future. So if that technological development for producing low nickel containing or battery that is not containing nickel, then Indonesia will be in big trouble. But for the time being, I cannot imagine that happening anytime very soon. And for the next decade, I think the nickel containing batteries will be the main product in the electric vehicle scene.
Okay, thank you. Next, let me invite Krishna Gupta to ask his question. Krishna, are you there?
Oh yeah, thank you, Pacho.
Sure.
Hi, Kang Hoon, great presentation, really enjoyed it. Quick question though. The government use lots of fiscal policies to invite people, right? So the main value added domestically would be from the government ownership in the whole value chain, probably apart from the employment and probably others. Do you have some kind of approximation on how much of the whole value chain, you know, from the downstream to the most upstream available right now, that is owned by the government, and how much by the domestic Indonesian producers and how much by foreign firms? Just approximation, I think, should be fine. It's hard to calculate that. Thanks a lot. Cheers. Oh, by the way, before you answer that, I totally agree with the previous question from Joshua. That's why discussing U.S. Battery demand is pretty important, right? Because Indonesian buyers probably can't afford the Ionic and can only afford the LFP batteries. So yeah, foreign market, definitely important, and great to see you discuss that U.S. policies. Cheers again. Over to you.
Thanks, Krishna. Kyung-hoon?
Thank you very much. So if I have that data, it will be very, very great. But for the time being, we don't have that data. And that's what we ultimately need to assess the overall net effects of these export ban and investment regulations. So we can try to tease out value added of various activities by going in, by digging into the annual reports or financial reports of SOEs and other foreign firms. But even then, I'm not sure how segmented those data will be. So one of the publications published by the Ministry of Mining actually has a value-added figure for the mining activities by product. So maybe that could be a starting point. And if you have any ideas regarding this information, I'll be happy to talk with you and maybe work together.
Thank you. Next is Surya Putra Wijaksana from NUS Singapore. Surya Putra, do you want to ask your question directly?
Okay, yeah, sure. Thank you, Pak Arianto and Kim for your presentation. I just want to ask whether that this downstreaming and the ban of export encourage the development of non-nickel technologies. I mean, just like substitution technologies out there. And then maybe more on the second question is that how does the IPEF interact with the nickel export ban? Because I think the IPEF is more about like manufacturing standards, right? Although it's not yet clear what is the IPEF about. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Kyung-hoon?
Thank you. So if you look at reports published by various international organizations such as International Energy Agency and various research conducted with funding from the European Union and the US government, most of the reports show that the level of concentration in nickel production in Indonesia is only going to increase over the next decade. And this is almost a fact considering the huge investment that has been conducted in the country. And yes, we will have to wait a bit, 5 to 10 years, to see whether Indonesia's production of nickel sulfate will really reach the scale that that can justify the various nationalistic policies. And of course, as I previously mentioned, the data on value added for each companies involved in this process will be very important in judging the overall effect. And the second question about IPF, I'm not an expert on IPF, but it does cover economic issues such as trade standard and also the trade environment. And I'm not saying that the US is likely to include such concession in the IPF, but it might use the IPF as a tool to judge who the US is going to give preferences to.
Thank you. Next is, let me invite Patrick Williams from DFAT. Patrick?
Does kind of buy.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity to comment. I think Dr. Kim may have just already answered my question, unless there's anything more wanted to elaborate on with regards to IPEF. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the question is answered already. So let me move to Rainer Oivers from CHIPS. Rainer?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Kim, for this very interesting presentation. My question would just be whether there can be more competition among foreign investors. It looks as if there's quite a strong, as you presented, strong investment of China, which is obviously also a state-led model. And then we have Korean companies coming in more downstream. But I'm wondering what could be ways to actually increase competition, and would that potentially lead to more efficiencies and maybe even address some of those environmental and labor issues that are so critical in that sector? Thank you.
Thank you, Rainer. Over to you, Kyung-hoon.
Yeah, thank you very much. More competition could lead to better environmental and labor outcome, but of course the ultimate issue will be whether the government can apply appropriate environment and labor laws to these companies, and whether it will be able to monitor these companies' activities. So the Indonesian government does have an upper hand in some sense because of the huge nickel resources Indonesia has, and it should actively apply various regulations on these companies to raise the standard for environment and labor. And the second question about IPF, the US will highlight the importance of sustainability and economic security and various issues related to sustainable free trade environment. But the US will have to be careful because Indonesia is currently quite skeptical about this agreement, and also we've seen India opt out from one of the pillars of IPF, namely the trade pillar. So it's a possibility that Indonesia could opt out if the US applies a very high standard in certain pillars of the agreement.
Okay, next is Jeff Nielsen from Sydney. Jeff.
Thanks, Chairman. Thanks for the presentation, Kyung-hoon. My question is, in one of the slides there, you're referring to the possibilities for extending this policy to other sectors, to other mineral laws, and I think you suggested that it was unlikely to be successful, mainly because of the smaller share held by Indonesia in production in those mineral laws. I was just wondering, just reflecting, I know in certain other commodities such as cocoa. Indonesia also implemented export restrictions that did lead to new foreign direct investment and did lead to increasing value-added exports. And they did that from a relatively small share of global production in cocoa. So I guess I'm interested to find out what might be some of those ingredients that might determine whether or not the policy is a success from the indicators being used by the Indonesian government, at least, in addition to the share of global production. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Kyung-hoon.
Thank you very much for that very interesting comment and question. I'm not an expert on agricultural production, and the agricultural area industry and the mining industry might be very different. In the case of the mining industry, my argument was that when a country tries to enforce the export ban regulations and also persuade foreign companies to invest in its domestic economy, it needs to have some kind of leverage. And the leverage in the mining sector is, of course, the reserves. And what I'm arguing is that compared to the nickel sector, Indonesia will have a much weaker leverage to persuade foreign companies to come into Indonesia rather than other countries and set up factories for processing and refining those metals.
Okay, thank you. Now let me invite Ross again. He has a follow-up question. So over to you, Ross.
Thanks, Archo. I hope you're asking me because nobody else wants to talk because I don't want to take up all the time. I just wanted to comment on the supposed benefits of this policy. I think you were asked what are the indicators of benefits, and one of the indicators I think was job generation. I think this should not be claimed as a benefit of the policy because all we're doing, it's a distortionary policy and we're pushing labor into this industry, but the labor is not formerly unemployed people. It's people who would be employed elsewhere and they're simply getting a better offer, and so they're shifting over to the sector. So I get worried when people claim benefits in the form of job generation. That's an illusion. We're just not taking a holistic view of the whole economy. And just in passing, I also note that if we're going to focus on increasing value added, we have to appreciate the fact that a lot of the value added will in fact flow to foreigners, not to Indonesians, because a lot of the capital for this will naturally come from foreigners who either invest in the smelting industry or lend to it. So a lot of the extra value added, in fact, I would guess a large part of the extra value added in this industry will go to the owners of capital, and those owners are very likely to be foreigners rather than Indonesian citizens. So I'm just trying to inject these bits of economic economists' realities into the discussion, I guess. So I put those comments on the table. Thank you, Acha.
Thank you, Ross. You have a comment to that, Kyung-hoon?
Thank you very much for both comments. I completely agree with both comments, but when people normally say job generation, I don't necessarily think they mean increasing the number of employed people or increasing the employment rate within the economy, but they're talking about job generation in high value adding industries. So if labor shifts from lower productivity sector, for example, agriculture, into a higher sector in the secondary and tertiary sector, of course, that leads to higher productivity of an economy and that contributes to economic growth. And whether nickel sector industrial policies will lead to that, of course, I don't think it will have a tectonic effect on the overall picture, but if we take a closer look at the value chain, it may contribute to attracting or employing more workers in higher value adding sector than in a situation where these electric vehicle production investment or refining investment had entered Indonesia. And regarding the much of the profit flowing into foreign capital, perhaps that's why the Indonesian government carried out nationalization, and it injected government's budget to buy shares in these foreign companies to have a larger share of larger share of benefits in the industry, and of course not sure whether they will have the financing capacity or technology capacity to enter the downstream industries, meaning nationalizing certain companies or pushing its private companies to enter these segments. But I completely agree. Much of the value added is flowing into foreign companies and will continue to do that.
Thank you. Now let me read a question from Riandi. It's quite long, so bear with me, Kyung-Hoon. First, Indonesia applies resource protection in several other sectors as well, like rattan, etc. But this other protection fails, while that of nickel is more relatively successful based on some metrics, especially in boosting its more processed manufacturing products. But since the global demand is ripe, would we have seen a similar outcome without applying resource protection? Maybe unlike the case in rattan, where global furniture manufacturers shift its sourcing strategy. Second, if resource protectionism spill over to the other sector as well, then global trading system will come to a chaos. How do we move forward in the future in balancing nationalism versus the need to have a disciplined global trading environment? Over to you, Kyung-Hoon.
Thank you very much. So regarding the first question, for those who think that industrial policies of East Asian economies have been successful, we often say the design of the policies are very important, and the government's capacity and power to apply these policies are very important. And on top of those, luck plays an important part, and geopolitical situation also play an important part. And maybe the nickel sector have been successful so far, from my point of view. Some people may disagree, as we heard before. Maybe because it was lucky in that the demand for nickel has been increasing steadily, and now the nickel demand is increasing even more quickly because of the EV revolution. And also, it's lucky in a sense that the US is in conflict with China on various fronts and is viewing economic security as an important theme, important issue in designing its diplomatic policies. So it's the nickel has become a very important commodity in terms of geopolitics and global economy. And maybe that has contributed to the success of nickel sector industrial policies from the Indonesian government's point of view. And how can we balance nationalism and the need to have a disciplined government trading environment? I'm fairly pessimistic considering how the major powers are conflicting with each other, and they're using various tools, including export controls and investment regulations, to hurt each other. And as I've just mentioned, that they are all regarding economic security as a key goal on various economic issues. So I'm very pessimistic about the role of multilateral institution going forward over the next several years, and we will have to see how the conflict between great powers pan out.
Thank you. Next, let me invite Aza Bimantara to ask the question directly. Aza?
Can you hear my voice?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for your insightful and profound presentation, Dr. Kim. So my question is, because I'm a lecturer from Universitas Muhammadiyah Malang in International Relations Department. I don't know whether you have mentioned this before in your presentation, because I sort of lost in connection before. My question is, after Indonesia lost a WTO dispute settlement with countries or organizations like WTO, like European Union offer raw nickel export moratorium, and after President Joko Widodo's responses to keep continuing the moratorium, do you think the competition of world nickel industry would escalate into sort of new trade war like in 2018? If not, do you think do you have any insight regarding President Joko Widodo's next move against WTO or countries or regionalisms who brought the dispute before? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Aza. Over to you, Kyung-hoon.
Thank you. I think trade war is a likely outcome, but the EU will cautiously approach this issue because it also is trying to promote the green industry, especially the electric vehicle battery industry within the European Union. And it has started tinkering with some protectionist policies itself. And there could be some retaliatory measures, but then that will occur several years from now. And Indonesia could change its position considering the huge investment that had already entered Indonesia. And by the time Indonesia would have established its position. We can't really predict how Indonesia will react then, but considering what the government is saying now, and considering how economic nationalism is so important in Indonesia's politics, I think it will be very difficult to back down anytime soon.
Thank you. There is one last question on my list here. Let me read it. It's again from Theo. He said it's a bit of speculative question. So his question is, if nickel processing will continue to concentrate in Indonesia in the next decade, do you think Indonesia will be a low-cost producer for nickel by then, thus providing economic justification? So no more protection because it's already low cost.
Yeah, I think I answered a similar question. I believe this is what's going to happening, and that's what most multilateral institutions and major countries reports are saying. So level of production concentration in Indonesia is going to increase, and it's going to reach a scale, and that will justify the adoption of industrial policies. But even then, we will various different measures will show different results, and we will have to see how they compare, how the results from using different data compare later on. But yes, it's a possibility.
Thank you so much. Let me check if there is other question or comments. No hands raised. No more question. Arif Yusuf. Let me invite you to speak directly, Arif. Let me check if you are allowed to talk. Go ahead, Arif.
Thank you, Acho. Thank you, Kim, for presenting in this seminar. I only have a short question. I think one of the narrative that we can offer just for us to be more cautious about this policy is normally other country experience. I know that there are not many studies yet to study the benefit, I mean, in rigorous way about this policy. I hope that people here, can anyone here hold on.
Okay, so
yeah, sorry. So the question is, is there any other countries experience similar similar country that use this policy, and is there anything that we can learn from it? And that's the short questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Arif. Kyung-hoon.
So when we normally talk about other countries experiencing industrialization, we normally talk about Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and so on. But in this case, it's a fairly unique in that it's resource-based industrialization strategy. And I cannot remember specific countries now, but there have been several studies on some successful cases of similar resource-based industrial strategies in Latin American countries and African countries. And I'll look it up and I'll share with you after the event. But I think the success cases of resource-based industrialization are fairly recent. And I think more studies will come out going forward.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Arif. There is no more question. Anyone else? No, if not, let me thank Dr. Kyung-Hoon Kim for his very insightful presentation and material, very topical theme now in Indonesia. And I thank all of you attendants who participated and also to attend this webinar. Thank you again for joining us. And one more time, thanks Kyung-Hoon Kim. I hope you can continue your work on this area. It's very important. So see you next time. So let me turn this back to Catherine or Alex, or do you have any other announcement? No? Okay, with that, we finish our session today. I believe we will have a webinar again on the 5th of May on fuel subsidy, but stay tuned for our mailing list. We will announce the next event. So until then, see you and thank you very much for today's activity and participation. See you next time. Thanks, Kyung-Hoon Kim.